Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Committee of the Whole. Approval of the agenda, please, as presented. Moved by Kevin. Any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Our item of business this evening is a presentation regarding the I'm reading the wrong thing. The Geological Survey of Canada regarding earthquakes in coastal BC. And we are welcoming Ms. Alison Bird this evening. Thank you and welcome, Ms. Bird. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'll advance my slide. Okay, I'd like to start off with this because it gives a good global picture of earthquakes in the region. If you look along I'm not sure if I can do this, but most of you are not going to be able to see it, but along the along the right-hand side of this image, you've got pink dots along the mid-Atlantic ridge going up through the Atlantic Ocean and into Iceland, which is an exciting place for geophysics. The country's being ripped apart by a ridge system. And much like the other faults around this globe, they are dominated by seismic activity. So the pink dots on the map are 5 years worth of earthquakes, magnitude 4 and above. The circles on the map are only 2 weeks worth of earthquakes. So it shows how active the planet is. You can see the Caribbean plate with the northern fault going through Haiti, the very large Pacific Sea plate, and that ring of fire, the intense seismic volcanic activity that rims the Pacific Ocean. So I took this off the seismic monitor, IRIS seismic monitor, just the week after the Kyushu and Ecuadorian earthquakes occurred. And a lot of people thought that they must be related because both of these earthquakes were large and they happened within the same week. But you can also see that there's a lot of other activity happening in the world, but it's not being reported on. So there are constantly earthquakes happening which just simply aren't being brought to our attention. And those earthquakes really aren't related at all. So this is a map of earthquakes within our country. It's hard to see how many earthquakes are on the map because they tend to happen over and over again in the same place. So just to give you an idea, we locate roughly 4,000 earthquakes every year in Western Canada. And in the Vancouver Island region, there are about 900 a year. So we do have them daily. They certainly keep us busy. So all of that data goes into developing the National Building Code of Canada's seismic provisions. You can see we're in a dark red area, which is fairly high hazard. The central area of Canada is blue. That means it's low hazard. It does not mean zero hazard. In fact, there's nowhere in the world that is zero hazard. An earthquake, damaging earthquake, can happen anywhere in the world. It's just more likely to occur along plate boundaries. So for me, it's an exciting place to be a seismologist because we've got all three major types of plate boundary right off our coastline. Off the west coast of Haida Gwaii, we have the transform or strike slip fault, very much like the San Andreas fault in California, so side-by-side motion. Very large earthquakes have occurred there in the past. We had an 8.1 in 1949. And of course, in 2012, we had a magnitude 7.8. The caveat for that one is it was a subduction-type earthquake. So there's a very complicated fault system up there. There's a strike-slip fault with a subduction zone underneath part of that fault. We've got a mid-ocean ridge, so the Juan Fuca Ridge. It's sort of like a miniature version of the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's where the Pacific and Juan Fuca plates are slowly moving away from each other. As the gap opens up between those two plates, there's material that rises up from the mantle, fills in that gap, cools and becomes new plates. So that's it constantly creating oceanic plate. Then the Juan Fuca plate, well, it's still relatively young, at just a few million years old, moves eastward and subducts beneath the North American plate. That's the one we're living on. So what we have off our coastline is the potential for extremely large earthquakes. Subduction zones are where the largest earthquakes occur in the world, the largest being in magnitude 9.5 in 1960 off Chile. So in subduction zones, earthquakes, of course, happen along those interfaces where the two plates are touching. Those are where you have the megathrust earthquakes. Those are extremely large, with minutes of shaking and, of course, tsunami guaranteed. Earthquakes also in between those megathrust earthquakes happen within the two plates. So as the subducting Juan Fuca plate bends and changes phase as it goes down into the mantle, it releases stress in the form of earthquakes. One such earthquake was the 2001 Nisqually earthquake down near Olympia at a magnitude 6.8. Also, they happen within the North American plate. And the danger with those is that they're very close to the surface. They can be close to populated centers. So you can have something like a Christchurch situation with these earthquakes. The bonus with subduction zones is you also get volcanoes. That's because when the subducting plate gets down deep enough, the temperatures and pressures are rather high, and it causes the plate to melt. So that melt comes up through the overriding plate and creates an arc or a line of volcanoes, like Mount Meager, which has been steaming lately, Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, Mount Hood, Mount Shasta. Those are all volcanoes associated with the subduction zone. So the reason we're having those earthquakes within the North American plate is, this is, of course, a highly exaggerated cartoon, but the two plates are locked. They're stuck together, but they're still moving toward each other. So what happens is the North American plate is pushed, and it bends and buckles. It's a 30-kilometer thick piece of rock. So as that bends, it releases stress in the form of earthquakes. And these can be quite large. They can be magnitude 7, 7.5. So those are quite dangerous events. So this is a map of 10 years of earthquakes in this region. We are somewhere underneath one of those blobs. You can see that the earthquakes in this region are not tidy. Like when you look at earthquakes in California, they're all lined up nicely along faults. This area is quite different. It's because the stress is needed to be released throughout this region as the plate bends. So I don't actually have, this is a shake map. I don't actually have a shake map for the 1700 earthquake. We didn't collect that kind of data back then. But what we did here was we took the shake map from the Sumatra earthquake in Indonesia in 2004, because it's about the right size. It's about a 1,000-kilometer long rupture. Our subduction zone is 1,100 kilometers long, so it fits well. So we overlaid the shake map on our region to see what it would be like here. You can see the entirety of Vancouver Island and much of the Washington, Oregon, and Northern California coastline is very badly impacted. Strong shaking, extremely strong shaking, and quite a lot of damage. The yellow area is still fairly strong shaking and some damage, and then the gray area is no damage, but no structural damage, but people still feeling the earthquake, and you can see it could be felt as far east as the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border. These are extraordinarily powerful events. If you think of the mass that's being moved, there's a phenomenal amount of energy that's released in one of these earthquakes. This is really a worst-case scenario, because not only does the shaking last for a long time, 3 to 5 minutes, but it impacts a really large region and such a large part of the United States that we cannot count on them at all in this kind of situation. We are on our own. This, of course, will cause a tsunami, which will impact coastlines, and the aftershocks from these events can last for years. So we found that a lot of people, they get through a major event, and they're starting to recover, but they keep feeling aftershocks. And this can really impact people psychologically. And we are noticing that we really do have to look at not just the physical impacts of an earthquake, but also the psychosocial impacts. So within a 50-year period, we have a greater than 1 in 10 chance of experiencing the megathrust earthquake. Those are very high odds. And that's within 50 years. That's not in 50 years' time. That could be tomorrow. Within a 50-year period, you have about a 1 in 3 chance of a strong damaging earthquake in the southern Vancouver Island region. So this is the megathrust earthquake plus those crustal earthquakes and the other ones that could be close enough that they could cause damage in this area. So a 1 in 3 chance is very high. I think it's really just best to assume it's going to happen, assume it's the worst case scenario, and plan for that. It does give some peace of mind when you do. I'm going to go back just a second. Now, Kenji Sataki-san is a phenomenal Japanese researcher, really cool guy, and he looked at what they called the orphan tsunami in Japan. So they called it that because they didn't feel any shaking, but a tsunami impacted their eastern coastline in 1700. And what he did was he looked at the heights of the waves along that coastline to determine where it might have come from. And he did a reverse model. And he was assuming it was going to be a Mexican earthquake, but it ended up being our Cascadia subduction zone, the last one that happened. So it hits Hawaii after about 5 hours, and Japan after about 8, and then northern New Zealand about 14 hours. And you can see this is a very powerful wave rippling out across the Pacific Ocean, and you can see that there's not just one wave, and it lasts for quite a number of hours. And we actually get a date and time for this. Usually with paleoseismology, you're usually lucky to get a year. We get 9 p.m. January 26, 1700. It completely jibes with First Nations stories of it being wintertime. They'd just gone to bed. The shaking was very strong. They were unable to get to their canoes before the waves came in. And unfortunately, villages all along the outer coast were decimated by this event. It was extraordinary. So what to expect from an earthquake? Obviously shaking. The video I'm going to show is only a few seconds long. It's from Kobe, which was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. It was fairly shallow near the city. The shaking actually lasted for 1.5 minutes, so you have to imagine what you're seeing to last much longer than what you do see. It's a bit scratchy. So I'm going to show that again just because it's hard to see what's going on. But you can see there's a very strong horizontal motion. The strongest waves in an earthquake are horizontal. Most things are built to withstand gravity, which is vertical. So you can expect a lot of things moving around in an earthquake. This is why when we tell you to drop, cover, and hold on, we want you to hold on to what you're underneath so that it doesn't shift away from you. It remains over top of you to protect you from falling debris. So shaking is affected by a few things. One of them is site conditions. So if you're at the top of a hill, you can have amplification. There was an earthquake in Hawaii several years ago that damaged a lot of observatories. Of course, they're built on the mountaintop on the Big Island, and they suffered some damage. Also, as seismic waves pass from bedrock into soft soils, generally speaking, you get amplification. So this is an earthquake in the Georgia Strait region. The seismometers, each line is a seismometer. They're all about the same distance from the earthquake, so you'd expect about the same amplitude of seismic waves. The top ones are on bedrock, and the lower ones are on the Fraser River soft soils. There's an incredible amount of amplification. It depends also where you are within a basin region. Masonry is the worst thing to suffer damage in earthquakes. This is in Christchurch in the Central Business District. Most historic buildings were damaged, and 70% of them had to be removed. I'd like to point out something that doesn't make it onto the news, though. Those buildings where they had been retrofitted and they performed well, no one ever films the ones that stay standing. So there were buildings that had reinforcement added to them, and they did extremely well in the earthquake. And that's why, of course, there's the BC Schools Upgrade Program gradually going through the schools around British Columbia that need upgrading to the current code to make our next generation safe. This is, of course, an example of how not to do reinforced concrete. This is from Kobe. They learned a lot from this earthquake, and Japan now has the best earthquake engineers in the world. The rebar, as you can see, is extremely good going up the columns and similar along the beams, but there's very little transverse or wrapped reinforcement to hold that together so it can stay linear and do its job of keeping things up and support it. What is there looks almost like wire rather than reinforcement, so that column is buckled. Houses, aside from this one, tend to do quite well in earthquakes. They're wood frame construction. If provided they're bolted to their foundation, they do well. Things that tend to fail, of course, are chimneys. They are the first things to go, and so I always encourage people to have extra reinforcement around their chimneys in the attic area. And the other things that fail are little additions like porches and poorly constructed additions onto the house. Unfortunately, the most safe construction is a square with no windows, but no one wants to live in that, of course. Fire sometimes follows. In 1906, in the lower picture, that's San Francisco. Of course, people were heating their homes and cooking with a wood stove. Nowadays, in the top right, that's Tohoku, people have downed power lines or ruptured gas mains. Landslides are quite common, especially if you're in a hilly area that has a wet season. Of course, we are completely vulnerable to that in British Columbia. This is in San Salvador. The buildings themselves did very well in the earthquake. You can see they were all low-rise wood frame construction. This landslide unfortunately took out 2.5 city blocks, and that's where all of the losses were. Liquefaction is extremely common. it's a bit like if you go down to the beach and the tide has been out for some time, then it's quite firm. If you can walk around, it's almost like you're on pavement. But if you stay in one place and you jiggle your legs around, all of a sudden your feet start to sink a little bit and water comes up around them. You've created quicksand. The same thing happens in earthquake. If you have sandy soils that have a lot of pore fluid in them, they turn into something like a liquid, and then they can no longer support properly the buildings or the roadways above them. So on the left-hand side there, you've got a Kokaili Turkey earthquake. The building is undamaged, but it is leaning against its neighbor and is no longer habitable. On the right, it's Christchurch. A lot of neighborhoods were like this in Christchurch, where the roadway simply failed, and people lost their vehicles simply because they nose dived into the sediment. It does go back to being solid afterward, but often, as in the right-hand case, neighborhoods might be deemed unlivable afterwards and too dangerous to live in or build on. Surface rupture is unlikely to occur here, but I like to show this example just because it's so dramatic. The railings at the top right and at the lower left used to be at the same level. This is a 10-meter vertical displacement. You're looking along the fault. This is a dam in Taiwan, the Shinkan Dam. And during the Chi-Chi earthquake, this is what happened. Luckily, the water above the dam was low, so the villages downstream were spared from flooding. When the company was given new money to rebuild the dam, they actually built a new dam upstream because this one's become a tourist attraction. This is the same earthquake, the same fault. So you can see when surface rupture happens, the ground is still together. The fault is closed. It doesn't open up and start gobbling cars and people and that sort of thing like in Hollywood films. So tsunami, I talk about separately just because they're kind of an important thing, and I think they deserve their own chapter. A tsunami is most often, 90% of the time, created by a subduction zone earthquake. So if you look at the left-hand image, you can see a dotted line. That's where the plate used to be, the overriding plate. When the slippage occurs during the megathrust earthquake, that pops up, the ocean goes down, and what happens is the entire water column above that subduction zone is shifted vertically. The tsunami waves then move outward, and I'd like to point out two things. First of all, this is a series of waves. It's not just one wave. A lot of people wait for the arrival of the first wave, and when it retreats, they think it's over. It's not. These tsunami waves can go on for hours. Secondly, this first wave is not usually the highest. A lot of people have lost their lives because they've seen the first wave come in, they've gone down to that level to watch the next wave, and the next wave has been much higher and swept them away. In the Chilean earthquake, the first wave was 20 centimeters. The third wave was the highest at 2.4 meters. That's an enormous difference. So there are two scenarios for here. One is the Cascadia subduction zone event. So that is our earthquake. The travel time for if you're on the outer coast, so if you're visiting Long Beach to Fino, you've got about a 15-minute window after the shaking stops to get to high ground. So it's a very fast event. The notification for these events is the earthquake itself. You're not waiting for a siren or any sort of notification from people. It simply cannot be processed fast enough. The data cannot be processed fast enough in order to provide you with that alert. You really need to use the shaking as your alert. Of course, there are also distant sources. So Alaska, like 1964, this is a simulation of what might happen from the Kermadec Islands. So distant tsunami sources, you're not going to feel the earthquake, but it's going to take a few hours for that tsunami wave to arrive. So the notification will come from officials. Often coastal communities have sirens in place. Mostly this is going to affect the outer coast. In somewhere like Souk, it's mostly the low-lying areas. So you want people off beaches and that sort of thing, but it's not going to probably come in any further than that. So tsunami are extraordinarily fast. In the open ocean, they can go 1,000 kilometers an hour. So it's a bit like a jumbo jet. As they approach land and the water shallows, that's when they slow down and build up and become extraordinarily dangerous. They are still going much faster than you can run. They're extraordinarily forceful. This is in Tohoku. The sea is black, and that is because the tsunami wave has churned up sediment from the ocean bottom, and that's coming over a tsunami wall. they carry a lot of debris. This debris is often cars, parts of houses, sometimes whole houses. You can see some silos in the background there. There's a phenomenal amount of force. This is not like a tide or a storm surge. There's the entire mass of that water column behind that wave. So even if the wave is only, say, 20, 30 centimeters, it's strong enough that it can knock you off your feet and sweep you around. So it's best to get out of the way. And they can look really innocuous at first. Sometimes it looks like just a trickling in of water. It doesn't look at all threatening, but it can build extremely quickly. I'd like to also point out there's a gentleman on top of the building there. He's vertically evacuated. You can see the building's very sturdy. It's got a lot of structure to it. In fact, the reinforcement's all on the outside of the building so you can see it. He's gone up as far as he can in that building, and a lot of people have survived tsunamis that way. If they cannot go inland and up easily, they can go up in a sturdy building, and it's a good response. You have a lot of topography here, though, so you've got a lot to work with. So even a small 2.4 meter wave, this is in Chile, can create a lot of damage. This is, they just toss around things like shipping containers, cars, boats, as though they're toys. It really is forceful. So, oops, I'm going to go back for just a second. Okay, so I've stopped it. This is a model developed by some colleagues down the hall from me at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And they've done the tsunami model to figure out the relative heights of waves. This is not the absolute height of waves, and the speed of the waves, so what the timing is going to be for your coastline. Now, it does not show you how far inland it's going to run. This model does not show that. It's done with a walled coast, and the maximum height of 3 meters is not what they're expecting. They just had to have a cutoff in order to run that model. So it gets to the outer coast of Tofino, and you cool it after about 15 minutes. And it makes its way around to Subduction after about 50 minutes. So you have 50 minutes to work with in order to get your grab-and-go kit, your family, and get to high ground. And you can see that this, that's one wave, and then the next wave is coming around, and then the next. And they're quite long. That they can be half an hour to an hour of coming in, and then the same amount of time going out, and then coming in again. And you could be evacuated for as long as 24 hours. Tsunami speeds are also a great concern. This is the left-hand side is in and out of Esquimalt Harbor, where they're expecting upwards of 10 knots. On the right-hand side, the speeds are much lower, but they're still threatening to people who are in boats. So I took this from the CRD website. It's a very rough first go at a tsunami inundation map. I'd like to point out that this is really rough. I mean, it's an estimate, and I think it should be taken with a grain of salt. For Subduction, it's not showing a lot of inundation. There are certain areas that do have a little bit more than others. I would assume that it would be much worse than this. I think that this is a very optimistic view of the tsunami. So I don't like to be, as I was saying to Sarah earlier, friends of mine call me Little Miss Doom and Gloom. I like to end on a bit of a positive note, and this is probably information you already know, but I feel it would be irresponsible for me not to say these things. Beforehand, it is crucial that you have a kit and a plan. So that's a plan for you, your family, and plan for your workplace. And the kit, the government tagline is 72 hours. I think that's extraordinarily optimistic. We're living on an island. My kit, personally, is for 2 weeks. And it's got things in it that I want to eat, because I think if you go through the trauma of an earthquake, you might need some comfort. And for me, food is part of my comfort. So there were some wonderful resources. The manual on the right is from Emergency Management BC. They have a wonderful series. The Earthquake and Tsunami Smart Manual is a start. There are also personal preparedness guides. I want to point out, though, there's a neighborhood preparedness guide. We're realizing more and more that neighborhood resiliency develops into community resiliency. It's really important for you to know your neighbors and be prepared with your neighbors. Make sure everyone has a kit. Know who on your block has medical training. Know who lives alone or might have mobility issues and might need to be checked on. Things like that go a long way to making you a safer community. And I think that this guide is a really great start for that. I want to point out that in your kit, dust masks are extraordinarily important. This is a picture of Christchurch after the earthquake. This is not smoke. This is building dust. You do not want to breathe this. It stays in your lungs for, well, probably the rest of your life. Everyone in my work has a bag under their desk with a bottle of water, a glow stick, a whistle, and an N95 dust mask. It's really important that it is an N95. That's the industrial level, so it can protect you from N95. That's November 95. Because the particulates in the air can be extraordinarily small. Also, we have asbestos in our building, and I really don't want anyone breathing in that. Before, it's a good idea to do a hazard hunt of your home and your workspace. We have a secure your space tagline. Make sure that tall and heavy furniture is strapped to studs in your wall. Even IKEA throws those straps in nowadays when you're buying for their furniture. It really makes sense to use them because you don't want a bookcase falling on you or your family members. Strapping your water heater to the wall is also important. You don't want that falling and damaging your house, but also that's a source of water after an earthquake. During the earthquake, of course, we encourage the drop cover hold-on method for surviving an earthquake. It's mostly falling debris in North American architecture that causes injury or death. So we want you underneath a table or a desk, something like that. If you cannot get underneath something, get into an interior corner, not an exterior corner of the room, and squat down and cover your head and neck. You want to make yourself a small, safe target. And know what to do in every room of your house. You're not going to be running to the next room in order to get into the ideal place. You need to get into somewhere in the room that you're in. So it's a good idea to practice that. And of course, we had the Shakeout BC earthquake drill last week, which I hope you all participated in. So afterwards, execute your plan. Do not use your telephone. It's crucial that only people who need emergency services use a telephone. If you need to get in touch with anyone, you're texting only. It's a short burst of bandwidth as opposed to a phone call, which takes up a lot of bandwidth. And we've realized that this is what's brought telephone lines down after an earthquake. It's not actually damage; it's people trying to call people. Really, you should be texting. Expect aftershocks, and as I said earlier, if you evacuate the coastline if the shaking is strong and long. I also wanted to put out a warning: you could be without sewage, water, electricity, and internet for possibly weeks. We've had some power outages where people panic after just a few hours, and that's a minor situation. You don't even have damage around you. Unfortunately, the lower left image could be the glamour of your life for a while. So I wanted to point out this. Oops, something went wrong there. Losses from various earthquakes. We've had several major earthquakes in the last few years. The Japanese earthquake, nearly 6,000 people were lost. Most of those were lost in the tsunami. Chile, 525 people. A lot of those were tsunami. People were stranded on an island that you had to get to by boat. They were unable to evacuate, and that island was overtopped. New Zealand, they had 2 earthquakes. The first one at magnitude 7.0 was actually exactly the same size as the Haitian earthquake. It was the same distance from Christchurch as the Haitian earthquake was from Port-au-Prince. They were about the same depth. In New Zealand, there was one person who had severe injuries. In Haiti, we lost over 222,000 people. It is unacceptable. And the reason for that is Haiti does not have an enforced building code, and they do nothing to educate their public on what to do in an earthquake. A magnitude 7.0 earthquake should not cause those kind of losses. So we are lucky in Canada. We have an enforced building code. It's a very good building code, very similar to California's, and we do a lot to educate our public. We have the Shakeout drill, and we have these signs like you see on the right-hand side there, telling people where to go in a tsunami situation. It's not just for the people who live in that community, but it's for the people passing through. They may be from somewhere where tsunamis are not a threat, so they need to know where to go. So please do visit our website. We have, if there is an earthquake, we put information at the top there or in the lower box where it says recent earthquake reports. If you click on the link for the earthquake, it will take you to a page specifically for that earthquake. If there is a tsunami threat, we include the link to the National Tsunami Warning Center. I'd like to also point out that little green box. That's a did you feel it? We have about 100 seismometers in Western Canada. We have tens of thousands of people who can tell us how they experience an earthquake. We actually do research on that because we need to know more. We need to know the intricacies of how that earthquake affected people, how it was experienced. And I've written 3 papers on that for the Haida Gwaii earthquake. So, I get geeky and excited if people fill those out. And please participate in Shakeout. It's a little late for me to be saying this now, but because it was last week, but at least next year. Do the drop cover and hold on. And because you are a coastal community, I encourage you to add on the tsunami evacuation. There's a tsunami evacuation drill in Tofino every year. They call it the high ground hike. You could come up with something similar, and maybe just have people evacuate to a high area and maybe teach them a little about earthquakes and tsunamis when you do that. And there's my contact information. I'm only too pleased to answer people's questions later on if they don't think of them today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bird. That the visuals are very impactful. So thank you very much for the presentation. I know you had to fit it into half an hour, and we're just coming up into our next meeting time, so I really appreciate that, and also your contact information so that we can think about some things and be in touch.
Okay.
Maybe quickly, very quickly, Rick, then, pardon me, Councillor Casper, then Councillor Ray.
And thanks to staff for making the arrangement. When I heard this presentation, we'll let the CRD board, I thought there's a lot of good information here, and it feels a little more council members and the members of the public should hear it. Just a question for you. Is it possible for us to actually post your presentation on our website?
Not this version of it, but I can give you a PDF version with speaking notes.
Okay.
I can provide that to Sarah.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. So is it possible then for us to have a different version to post on our website?
Yeah, I'll give you one with speaking notes just so that people have the full story.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ray.
Yes, thank you, and great presentation. I really appreciate it. I have a quick question. With the simulation where we saw the water coming down, you said Souk had about 15 minutes. I'm assuming that would be an earthquake within the Cascadia, not from across.
Yeah, this is the Cascadia Subduction Zone model.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Bird.
Thank you. Good evening.
There is public input on the agenda, so if there's anyone here that's specifically for today's Committee of the Whole presentation, we have, I can take a question or two. Okay, thank you. So on that note, I'll call for a motion to adjourn the Committee of the Whole, please. Moved by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor? Opposed? Is carried unanimously. Thank you. Just